Welcome to JW3 Online. We're so glad that you've tuned in, and if you don't know who we are, JW3 are a one-of-a-kind Jewish community centre in London that's open to everyone. If you want to know more about us, like us on Facebook or YouTube, and check out the rest of our events online. We hope you enjoy the programme. Hi everyone, and welcome to Young JW3's latest series, Denomination, with me, Joe Hyman, and our guest this week, Rabbi Oliver Joseph. We are a denomination, a nation of denominations, made up of Jews of all different types and stripes, and we're here to celebrate that. This series is here to take the stereotypes you may have about other communities and throw them out the window. We're here to learn about different types of Jews and learn more about communities different to our own, because we believe that unity comes from knowing each other and celebrating both where we're the same and where we're different. Each week we'll hear from an emerging Jewish leader about their denomination, community, and what matters to them. If you're watching along, tell us what denomination you relate to and why, or not at all. We would love the conversation to continue on our social media platforms. But for now, welcome, Rabbi Oliver Joseph. How's it going?
Yeah, really good. Joe, thank you so much for having me on this show and celebrating all our different denominations and the variety in our community.
So glad to have you, and really thank you for being part of it. First questions first. Let's just throw out the main question of this program, which is, which denomination do you relate to for the purposes of this program, and why?
I belong to the Masorti community. I work for several different Masorti communities, including North London Synagogue primarily, and the Havurah. And I'm part of this community because I grew up in it and because I relate to it most closely ideologically.
Great. Well, we'll hear a little bit more about that later. But before we jump into the kind of big questions of denomination, let's hear a little bit about you. How did you become a rabbi? Why did you become a rabbi? What was that journey like?
So I became a rabbi, not really by designation, but by perhaps coincidence of life. I grew up in North London. I grew up in a Jewish family and in the community that I currently work for. I always took an interest in my Jewish life. I always was spiritually and religiously connected, and having done work out the other world, working primarily in politics for a few years after I graduated from university, I was asked by my rabbi who I currently work with, Rabbi Wittenberg, if I'd be interested in training to be a rabbi. He actually initially asked my dad first, who said, sure, sounds like a really odd question to ask a nice Jewish boy, but you can ask him if you like. And at which point he came to me and I said, no, but I was interested to carry on the journey of learning and of kind of intensive and serious Jewish learning in Jerusalem, and went off for a year of at yeshiva to kind of explore this journey. 7 years later, I qualified as a rabbi, following lots of different tracks all at once. But it was a journey which it was a destination which worked itself out as I went, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. So it wasn't part of such a bigger plan, but you are our first headhunted rabbi by their rabbi from their childhood. So that's
good times.
Exciting. Happy times. It's exciting.
Yeah, headhunted might be a stretch. We were always close, so he didn't seek me out. We were in conversation over many years.
Brilliant. Really lovely to hear. So for the purposes of our audience out there who may not have heard of the denomination that you work with and affiliate with, let's do what I like to call the denomination minute. And that's 60 seconds to describe your denomination as clearly as possible for our audience to know, all right, that's what it's about. That's what I can kind of, tell a friend or understand for myself. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to bring up a real life online timer to make sure that you keep that minute and let us know a little bit about your
I'm
kind
terrified,
of Judaism.
Joe. I'm terrified. This is a big ask.
It's scary, but you know what? It's important. So let's hear. 1 minute up now. Go.
Great. So Masorti Judaism, who I currently work for and have been involved with for a very long time, is an inclusive and welcoming community, spiritually diverse, and the things that we are most keen to welcome people relate to what it is to be a woman included in Jewish life, what it is to be gay, and what it is to also question where Torah comes from. These questions should be a part and included in our Jewish life, and we are a diverse community of many different types of practice, a community which welcomes all and all types of learning, including critical learning, inside of our Jewish community.
Brilliant. All right, we got you before the minute hit, so that's pretty impressive. So there's questions that you've addressed in that. Kind of about inclusiveness, inclusivity, but also about the kind of way we think about Torah and where it comes from, and that's really interesting. And we'll dive into that a little bit more as we go. But what I'm really interested to hear, kind of on a really kind of historical, what some people may love and some people may be like, oh, I don't want to hear about historical stuff. But where does your denomination's name come from? How long has the denomination been around? I think we often think that denominations have been around forever, since the beginning of Judaism, since the beginning of time. But tell us a little bit about its history and why it's called Masorti Judaism. Yeah.
So I guess the first place to begin with is that Masoret is the tradition. It's a word that has been synonymous with the handing down and the passing down of the Jewish tradition over very many generations. That's the bit which is ancient. Like you say, denominations have not been around for very long in the way that we understand them in the last 100 years. But the word Masorti and Masoret is a word terminology that's been with us since ancient times. Our Masorti community comes from the work of Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who's a new book of which I'm reading about just as we speak, by a guy called Harry Friedman that you can look up. Who examines the history of Rabbi Louis Jacobs' thought and teaching. And he is the father of the Masorti movement. He was the JC, I think at the time, called him the best chief rabbi that we never had. He was a premier scholar and also born and bred in the UK, and worked in London as a rabbi. And one of the things that he was known for was his photographic memory. He had an incredible knowledge of Talmud and Torah, and he was classically educated in the yeshivot in Manchester and also in Newcastle, the Gateshead Yeshivot, and was able to bring together the modern aspects of critical study or critical academic study of Torah and aspects of the tradition as represented by the rabbis in the Talmud. And for that, he ultimately paid a price, because for some, I guess, more conservative elements within what was then the Orthodox community, he was too connected to critical studies, primarily which questioned where Torah came from. So the classic story, as it goes, that is represented inside our Sefer Torah, inside of our holy tradition, says that the Torah was handed down from Moshe on Mount Sinai, and that's for all to see. That is inside a tradition. But how we deal with that, at least inside academic studies, is a whole other question. And Rabbi Jacobs pushed those boundaries. The price he paid was that he left the community in what is called the Orthodox community, in what is called the Jacobs Affair, and from that, his community went with him, and he set up what is now the New London Synagogue, and other Masorti communities were formed around him. We have sister communities in the US that go, and Israel and many other parts of the world, that are, in the US it's called the conservative movement, in Israel it's called the Masorti movement, but the sister movement in the US comes from a different historical origin, which is by way of the Reform movement. People in the Reform movement wanted to be more observant and more closely aligned with living by way of Jewish law, and through that the conservative movement was born. So they're sister movements and they do line up, but their historical origins are different, which does have an effect on the essence of what the movements look like today. But we were born of the Orthodox communities.
Really, really fascinating. I mean, it's interesting to think about denominations in the context of the countries that they were born in and how they relate to communities outside the UK. It's really kind of fascinating to hear about how this critical approach to Torah, kind of a more academic approach, was at the center of kind of the birth of Masorti Judaism, and that kind of how that affects what the community looks like now is really interesting to me. And I'm going to ask you about how that affects where the community looks like today in a very practical way for our kind of audience to understand through particular practices and how they look in a Masorti community. So I'm going to ask you to talk about what Shabbat looks like in a Masorti community, what kosher or food ritual looks like in a Masorti community, and what prayer or synagogue looks like and how it's set up. And the purpose of this is to really just give clear, practical examples of how this history, philosophy, values affect what we would think of as kind of traditional Jewish practices. These aren't all the Jewish practices that we could have discussed, but there are kind of main ones that highlight particular differences between communities. So Shabbat, kashrut, food ritual, and prayer, what do they look like within your community? And kind of tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's probably the least understood in much of Jewish community. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of lay out some of these pieces. I guess in this house, Shabbat Observe, in the house that I'm currently sitting in, we're in COVID lockdown, so we're still at home. That Shabbat looks very much like any other Shabbat observant home. We don't use electricity on Shabbat. We don't switch off or on lights or ovens or electronic devices. My mobile phone has a little hibernation for 25 hours. And largely that observance is exactly the same as any traditional Shabbat observant place. I get, the essence of Shabbat is about, for 25 hours, ceasing from the modes and acts of creation that otherwise govern the rest of our 6 days in the week. And that part of spiritual and religious life, for me, in this year especially, is really, really crucial, especially when, like now, we spend a lot of our time online. Switching off for 25 hours is really important. I can't think just at this moment of a way in which our Shabbat would differ from any other halakhically observant community that is celebrating and marking Shabbat. And that really lines up with much of what it is to be a Masorti Jew, in the sense that there is no fundamental difference halakhically, according to Jewish law, from being a Masorti Jew than it is to be somebody who practices inside Orthodox communities. There is little differential or divergence. So the same would be the case for Shabbat, for food, for kashrut. If you don't live in a vegetarian house, you would buy, as we do, kosher meat, which is slaughtered in the traditional way and prepared in the traditional way, which in this generation means largely that you buy from a kosher butcher. We don't eat seafood, things with shells on, incrustations, crabs and prawns and all of those good things we don't partake in. And along the same lines as maybe perhaps some of your other guests might have described, we don't mix milk and meat. And those things are, again, I don't want to repeat, but line up again with Orthodox colleagues. I guess when I'm reading the history of Louis Jacobs, one of the things that is thrown into the book is that he attended weddings that weren't with kosher caterers. Now, this is a complicated aspect of what it is to be a Masorti rabbi, because at the same time as being embracing and welcoming, sometimes rabbis in particular have to draw lines and put themselves on the inside or the outside of particular communal functions and communal events. So when it says that Rabbi Jacobs attended functions where there was non-kosher food, I don't imagine for a second that he was breaking kashrut. But non-kosher food is food which is forbidden to Jews, which is the things which I mentioned, pig and shellfish and so on. There is a broad spectrum of how people and communities choose to interpret and accept upon themselves some of those aspects of what it is to live a life which is to be kosher. And part of the job of a rabbi is to negotiate that. I think as a Masorti rabbi, I probably have more room to maneuver in terms of how to respond to celebrations like of bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah or weddings in particular, when trying to decide whether I can or can't show up. And one of the great things about our Masorti communities is that we're pluralist in some small way, which means that to a level, rabbis in my community get to decide how to interpret the different laws and the different stringencies on their own terms for their own communities. So that doesn't mean eating non-kosher food, but it does mean responding in pragmatic ways to some of the realities that we see in our communities, if that makes sense.
So there's not a centralized kind of structure that dictates something. It's each community decides in some way what they do, but in the kind of wider structure of Jewish law. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. We have each rabbi is responsible for the halachic standing of his or her community, and we have a European Masorti Beit Din headed by Av Beit Din, Rabbi Chaim Wiener, who's the head. I can always go to him and ask questions, which I often do, and he can guide me. But it would be rare, unless I was doing something really, really naughty, for him to come along and say, Oliver, you are outside of the pale. I guess part of the aspect of being rabbi is to also be trusted to make some of those decisions and calls. I would hope never to get a call from him to say that I'd done something that was so far outside of those lines.
Great. Okay. Really, really interesting. And when it comes to prayer, yeah.
So prayer again is the same. I mean, we are governed to pray 3 times a day, Ma'ariv in the evening, Shacharit and Mincha, the morning prayer and the evening prayer. I guess the only difference that you might find is that in many of our communities, you would have a woman who would lead tefillah, would lead prayer. And that would set us apart from some other communities, depending on which direction you went into, your more traditional or less traditional. And that aspect of women both leading prayer and in some communities reading from the Torah is a defining aspect of what it is to be within the realms of that pluralism again, because not all communities are entirely egalitarian. So within the Masorti movement, there are also different practices there.
Really, really fascinating that there's differences between different communities. I'm intrigued to know if there are particular practices or particular beliefs that Masorti Judaism feels that a community member has to do or believe. Are there particular things that kind of form a boundary of kind of what's Masorti and what's not, or is that not part of the community's approach?
I think Masorti Judaism is dependent on largely fixed inside a vision of religious community where people aren't mandated or instructed to believe a certain way. I think that's also a way in which we differ from some other religious minority communities in this country in terms of just reflecting for a moment on church life. I don't think we are a religion specifically built on belief. That doesn't mean there aren't beliefs that we might ascribe to or see as common in our communal life and our religious life and in our philosophical and religious writings. They are certainly present, but I don't demand of a fellow Jew to believe X or Y. We have this interesting statement which is said when somebody finishes their conversion in front of the Beit Din, now breaking the confidence of the Beit Din, and somebody says, and I think the statement is, do you understand that Judaism is a religion based on belief in one God? And these are pro forma questions. They're questions that you say yes or no to. You know, that you're prepared in advance, and if you answer the question wrong, you're basically saying, I don't want to go forward and finish my conversion. So the answer to the question is yes. The second question is, do you accept that belief? And the answer is yes. But listen to the wording of that question. It's asking you, do you understand that we're a Judaism based in belief in one God, which is at the center of many of our prayers that speaks of this God of Yud Hey Vav Hey, this one God. And then you're asked to say, do you accept the belief? It's less explicit than saying, do you believe in God? And that's the Judaism that I believe in. That's the Judaism that I'm proud to be part of. One of my favorite teachers, Rabbi Joe, often uses the terminology of, if somebody says they don't believe in God, I said he will say to them, oh, please tell me about the God that you believe in, that you don't believe in, that I probably don't believe in either. Which is a nuanced version of what it is to be a religious and God-fearing person.
Understood. Really, really insightful. I want to hear from our audience at this point. Tell us in the comments, are there particular practices that you do in your community that are different to maybe what Rabbi Oliver shared, or different to other speakers? Let us know what you do or don't do. We'd love to hear from you, and also kind of what you believe and what you practice in your kind of way of being Jewish. One question that I ask everybody is about stereotypes, because the reason I wanted to do this program was to take stereotypes and explain why they exist, and give people who kind of have stereotypes about them, which is kind of everyone in different contexts, kind of understand, give us a kind of space to understand where that kind of affects them and what it looks like for them. So I want to ask you, what's the biggest stereotype people have about you as a Masorti rabbi and your denomination? And importantly, how does that make you feel? I think it's important for people to understand how stereotypes affect people's individual lives.
It's an interesting question. I think on one level we're not well enough known as a community. We're one of the smallest and fastest growing Jewish communities in the UK. So we're perhaps not well enough known to have to suffer from experience of stereotypes in a large scale. I think often we are grouped in to this kind of progressive pot that doesn't really appreciate or understand the nuance that you're basically giving me a platform to describe. You know, what are the aspects of Masorti Judaism that are real, not just imagined? So often when I have a first conversation with a couple or a person or a this or that, I have to actually get inside and describe what the differences are, and they are actually quite slight in some way or other. The way in which we differ from Reform Judaism for your average Jew might not be significant. In the same way, the way that we differ from Orthodox Judaism might not be so fundamental, depending on which way you're coming from. I think the other thing that I personally struggle with is kind of not a stereotype where a Masorti or a progressive rabbi isn't the real deal. And that's partly my own stuff I have to work out, like my own sense of inadequacy. I didn't grow up in an Orthodox community. I didn't grow up learning Mishnah and Talmud Torah from a very, very young, rabbinic texts and Bible from a very, very young age. So I had a lot of catching up to do when I began my own rabbinic studies. So that's partly my own stuff that I have to contend with. We all have self-doubt in our own lives. And but that journey is sometimes a little bit tough, because I would just say it's the stereotype of progressive rabbis sometimes takes a bit of working out, because for some people, rabbis, if I went to Israel, for example, I said that I'm a rabbi, for many of the secular community, like that's almost an abhorrent thing. And to understand that there are progressive Jews in the world, for some, small sectors of Israeli society, that's a bit of a jump. So I guess the progressive rabbi and the Masorti rabbi kind of sits in between these two, the rock and the hard place between more Orthodox communities and more I'm not Orthodox for the Orthodox, and I'm not liberal enough for the liberal. So it's a fascinating place to be, and it's a fascinating journey.
Thank you, and I thank you for sharing honestly about your experience of it, and where it kind of becomes difficult, or where that perception or that assumption becomes difficult, and kind of plays into one's own kind of perceptions of themselves. It's really difficult, and I appreciate that. And for those watching, remember the tradition says that Rabbi Akiva started learning when he was 40 years old. So,
and I'm not even there yet, despite
he's not even there yet.
See, I'm still got 2 years before I have to begin my religious journey for proper.
Exactly. So anyone can be a rabbi at any age, if you'd like to. But on that kind of topic of stereotypes and the way people perceive other communities, what I'd like to ask our rabbis that come along to talk about the denominations is about other communities. And I want to ask about what's one thing that another community outside of your denomination is doing that the Masorti Judaism community isn't doing, that you're really excited about, that makes you think, oh wow, that's really impressive, and I love that.
I think that I would answer this question in general terms. I think we are a community which is strong in the fact that it's growing, in the fact that it has strong roots in the UK, in the fact that we continue to kind of bring in new people to our community each day, which is exciting. I think there are lots of good things going on in many different parts of the Jewish community. And one of the strengths of any community is that ability to not draw such hard lines. I think that perhaps the bit that's to push back on denomination, one of the bits that's missing in our quite fragmented and segregated community is that overlap between. And I think that this generation of young people, at least younger than me, aren't necessarily interested in clear delineated lines of you are this or I am that. My community believes in this, my community believes in that. I think young people growing up, at least in this generation, are much more fluid. So one of the skills that I have to embrace and adopt as a rabbi is to say, we are one Jewish community, and to look beyond those boundaries and say, what's great in this Jewish community that's going on, and what can I learn from? I think, Limud is a wonderful space to be, a space of learning and open learning. I think the yeshivot that we see in many of the Orthodox communities, which are places which are a rite of passage for young people to go to, yeshiva and seminaries, traditionally for women, which are a rite of passage for young people to go to, are crucial in terms of formulating and fomenting Jewish identity and Jewish learning. And those exist in our community, but they are less a rite of passage and more for people to buy into who choose that journey. A couple of things that spring to mind in that respect.
That's really, really insightful. I think that I'm thinking about kind of the rite of passage that is going to a Jewish institution kind of abroad, or maybe for a long extended time, is part of some communities and isn't part of others. And also that piece that you shared, which I think is really interesting, and it also kind of it questions the whole structure of denomination as a program, but that's important. Which
back
is
to the drawing board, Joe.
we're just gonna stop now. Is what does it look like to be able to learn from everywhere, to kind of take the Pirkei Avot, who is clever, one who learns from everybody,
right.
and have that approach to denominations and community in general.
Right.
That's really, really interesting, and I think that's something I think lots of communities are interested in developing as well. So thank you. Going kind of zoom forward to the future, 10 years from now, what are the biggest priorities, I guess, for you, but also for your denomination in the next kind of 10 years? What do they look like? What's the priority going forward?
I think that the priorities going forward, continuing in the line of our discussions up until now, I think, ongoing Jewish learning is crucial. We have a wonderful partnership with the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem that I studied in for 3 years, and has been, a foundation stone of growing and developing Masorti community in the UK. I think we need to get more young people into long-term Jewish education, and ultimately to train more rabbis to teach our growing and emerging new communities. I think we also need to kind of continue, as we do, to throw lifelines and support to emerging Jewish community, and support that diversity of community that coming up in across the UK. I work for 2 new communities, one of which I know you know well, I believe you know well, Joe, Ohel Moed, and another is the Havurah. Both of them are different drashot, you might say, like different interpretations or different callings on what Jewish community might look like, but both come with that, to use another word, chidush, that kind of newness that young people are desiring, including me on some level, are desiring in this generation. And so, yeah, those are the 2 aspects I guess that I would draw attention to. One is like to be a really serious community of learning and developing and growing. It's at the center of our Jewish tradition and center of what I believe it is to be a good Yiddilah, a good Jew. And the other is to really embrace creativity and newness in our Jewish community, so that we support all ways and manifestations of building community going forward. I think in that respect, Masorti Judaism and our Masorti community will continue to be in good strength, both now in this quite devastating pandemic, and also from going forward.
Thank you for this insight into Masorti Judaism. Thanks for joining us on this program to share with us what your community looks like, and what its values are, and what happens kind of behind the name Masorti Judaism. For our audience, thank you for joining us. Please check out our episodes Monday at 8:30 p.m. If you've missed any previous episodes, check out our Facebook or YouTube, subscribe or like to keep up to date with all of our events. And remember to join our Young JW3 community Facebook group, where I update everybody on what's going on. But for now, enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope you've had a lovely time at Denomination. Thank you.